Anything else in this original paragraph? What jumped out to you as maybe something extraordinary or maybe hard to achieve, or it gives you an insight into what Paul's after here?
I think when it says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, I think sometimes because we're in our own skin and we see life from our own perspective, that we can have a motive of selfish ambition or vain conceit without being aware of it.
I know.
So we always need to ask ourselves, even doing good things can be selfish ambition.
Let me tell you the worst for me.
To check our motives in all that we do.
Do you think preachers have selfish ambition?
They're the worst. Not you. Because I do.
Well, let me give you an example where, oh my goodness, we were at a church where they took the parsonage and it was next to a church building. They built an entryway and turned that building into office building, which we needed, and they did a great job of it. But as they had finished the rooms and the nice offices, I looked and I said, oh man, that office that's on the southwest corner, it's got all the windows. That's got to be my office. So I made sure that the youth minister was not going to get in that office. That's going to be mine. And after a while I thought, and I'm trying to remember what brought it to my attention. I was like, Lord, this isn't right. I'm trying to do everything and wiggle everything because this is what I want. So you know what I had to do? I thought, okay, Lord, you got to forgive me of my selfish ambition, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the youth ministry. I'm going to say, now we have these two offices. You pick which one you want. So I did that. And he picked the room that didn't have any windows. He said, I want that room. I said, really? He said, well, it's because I've got a lot of banners and all kinds of things we use for the youth group. And those walls can be great for me to put stuff up on. I went, well, thank you, Lord. I got that as a blessing when I finally was able to say, quit your selfish ambition and ask the person first, So, and we all have those things. Oh, it's where we're challenged constantly. And if you don't check it by the Spirit in the body of Christ, selfish ambition can destroy churches.
Preachers are just people too.
You think? Oh boy, are we ever. But this is a challenge, isn't it? Selfish ambition. Yeah, Barbara?
I remember one thing about this congregation, they never canceled church. I remember once there was a big snow on the ground
yeah. Churches.
Bad, I guess.
Well, we had a policy, even up in Michigan, because we get a lot of snow. The policy was that we would never cancel church. We finally decided on it. And if you can't make it because of the weather, no problem. In both cases, when we were in Lansing, but also in Troy, outside Detroit, we had someone that lived close to the building. So they could always, even if there was 2 foot of snow, they could tromp next door and open the building. But that was kind of how we handled it. And it's funny because in some churches, until they worked through that became a very serious topic of contention. How dare you close the church? Well, just leave it open. Don't worry about it. If you can make it, you can. If you can't, you can't, that kind of thing. But it is interesting, isn't it? How that certain topics become sort of a powder keg for congregations when it really shouldn't be. See, that's the thing. No matter what, I've known of churches that split over what kind of carpet to have in the auditorium. I've known of churches to split over what kind of pews to have when they put in a new auditorium. You just can't imagine the list of things I'm aware of through the years that churches fought over and split over. And I'm like, are you serious? So Jesus came and died on the cross so we could fight over what color carpet. And when you say it like that, you're like, it shows you how nonsensical people have been, And we need to hear this because I can remember when I was growing up, I didn't hear any preaching out of Philippians 2. That nobody dealt with that. And I can remember as a young preacher reading through this, I thought, wow, this is pretty powerful stuff. And I don't remember anybody teaching it. But it's critical, isn't it? So that the selfish ambition and vain conceit, boy, those are two strong things that too often motivate people within the life of the church. Now,
I grew up in this country congregation.
okay.
We didn't have any classrooms.
Oh.
So we had classes in the cars.
Yeah. Oh,
Yet those people, the same, their ancestors they built a new church up in Scotland and Elgin, you know.
yeah.
So there's still people going to church, and so that didn't hinder them from being Christians, you know.
No. Well, I think what you point out, Barbara, is think of how much our cultural value of comfort has influenced too much of what church is about. The reason I know this, I had a teacher when I was in Dayton, Tennessee. He died. His name was what was his last name was Heddendorf. So very German, Heddendorf, a great teacher. He and I, before he died, we were talking about, because he was looking at the value of comedy in our culture. And then he became very interested in something I said. So we were doing a lot of research and email back and forth, how the value of fun has sort of crept into a lot of churches. And where I discovered it was when I would ask for people to volunteer for church work, and the youth minister would too. The first response people were starting to give was, well, is it going to be any fun? I'm like, what's that got to do with anything? What if it's not fun? Are you telling me you're not going to show up? So we just have to be real careful in letting cultural values dictate the mission of the church. And sometimes I don't think we realize how powerful it's been in the past.
I was listening to a preacher on the way to church this morning,
Uh-huh.
and he put that up. He said, Sunday is the Lord's day. It's not fun day. It's Sunday.
Oh, there you go. It's not fun day. It's Sunday. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And too many people, there is the belief now that too many people in a lot of your larger big churches, especially if they're classified kind of as a mega church, the draw of mega churches is that people can attend and still be anonymous and not accountable to anybody. And that doesn't even open up the question of the style of worship's going on. But even at a fundamental level, it's not really healthy spiritually to think that you're part of a congregation and you're anonymous and you don't want anybody to bother you. It's kind of like you're showing up at some big theater production or something. I go in, I go home, I don't want anybody to bother me. I'm like, do you think that's God's vision of the church? Is that why Jesus died on the cross? So I can go to something, go home, and you not bother me? That doesn't sound like what the church is supposed to be at all, Nancy.
Another thing in this passage is something to grasp. I think that's
Yes.
seized by force or
It can be.
or pushing some
Mhm.
forward.
Mm-hmm.
And the mind of Christ has always been to put others above himself.
Well, because
Humility
you said that, when we get
of himself.
to the example that he's going to give of Jesus himself, that's the very thing he said. That one of the things that Jesus really didn't do was to grasp or hold on to his how can I say, it's almost like his position in heaven with God. He gave that up. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But that's a crucial aspect because it challenges the human tendency to grasp and to hold on things the way that I want them to be, so that I can be in power and I can, satisfy my, vain ambitions, empty ambitions, and whatever. But it's not about me.
And what we see nowadays, looking around our culture, when people get power,
Mm-hmm.
they will do anything to hold on to it.
Mhm.
And I think that's why we adore, we love George Washington. He could have grasped that power
Oh, yeah.
and kept that as a throne. He could have been a king.
Mm-hmm.
He could have reigned till he died,
Mm-hmm.
but he stepped back.
He chose not to, yeah.
That's
Mm-hmm. Which was interesting historically, because that means early on in the DNA of the thinking of people in America, you don't have someone in an authoritarian kingly role, but a president's role where you step away from power. How many nations in history did that ever happen to, where someone in power of their own free will stepped away from it?
Very seldom.
George Washington.
That is not the history of humanity. So that's how unique America began, like that. And it's a good example of, and I'll say this and then we'll move on.
You know what you
I have seen leadership in churches where people felt like they had positions of power and they used it against people in the congregation, and it was horrible. You know, Jesus, yeah, Barbara.
The subject, I have a question that's other than that.
Oh, okay.
Are we doing wrong if we don't go along with the elders? Can we say things to them if we don't see what they're doing is right?
Well, that's a good question. And it's been one that historically in our churches, we haven't really known very well how to handle it. So here's my perspective. I think it's a question that is very, very important. And we've not known how to follow up. Think about this. In church history, we're known as a religious group that has what's called autonomous polity. In other words, we don't have other churches or hierarchy telling us what to do here. And a lot of the Baptist churches are kind of set up the same way. But because we're autonomous, the leadership is within the church. Here's the interesting thing. It's also recognized as congregational leadership. It is the congregation that institutes and installs, ordains, whatever word you want to use, elders in that role. Now, if a person or persons in the eldership are not doing what they ought to be doing, and whether it is violating some of this, or maybe some kind of, what's the word that's used? There was a phrase that used, moral turpitude.
lording it over the brother.
Lording it over or even some kind of moral failure. You know, maybe they went out with secretary or something. But if it's an issue that needs to be addressed and the person should no longer be an elder, guess what? If the congregation installed that person as elder, the congregation has the authority to ask that elder to step down. And we've not been good at congregations following through with that. In fact, a friend of mine, when he was working with a church in Cuba, Kentucky, there's a town called Cuba, Kentucky. The elders there became so toxic in that church that he had to help the whole congregation have a meeting, address these three guys that were just destroying the church, what they were doing, and the whole congregation had to ask these three to step away. And he said it was a messy process. It had to be done. But when we did it, he said, what they discovered was it was probably the right thing to do, because those three guys got mad and they left the church. And he said after they left the church, it began to grow and people could finally breathe. So it's a wonderful question, Barbara. We just don't have a good history.
They should show partiality,
Well,
you know.
Here's a wonderful question to follow up. I mean, church leaders are human, so they're going to make mistakes. But at what point does a mistake become so toxic on the church that it needs to be addressed to the extent that the person needs to be asked to step down? And that's a tough question. I don't know that there's always the exact line you can draw in the sand, but it's one that we haven't historically dealt with very well. Yeah. It's a good question. What's that?
You get in trouble.
Yeah.
You better not step out on that limb by yourself.
Well, right. Yeah,
I know that.
yeah, oh, yeah.
Before you know it, the congregation's against you, even though all you do is ask a question.
Yeah, sometimes just to ask the question, you get in trouble.
Yeah,
So, here's what I told this to Nancy a couple of weeks ago. The astounding thing about the church to me and amazing is that God envisions that the gospel goes out into the world through a group of human beings who have flaws all over the place. But we make up the church, and God's design is that through those of us who are human beings that make up the church, human as we are, flaws and all, the good message still needs to go out. So we can't use that as an excuse to say, well, we're humans, so who's going to listen to us? Well, God's design is that the gospel be in us and through us for the world, even as human as we are. Nancy?
Whenever my pride butts up against what I hear God telling me to do, what Christ would do, I always look at what he has done for me. I always think about him submitting to this death on the cross. First, giving up heaven, counting it not robbery, giving it up, coming to earth, then dying. When I think of all those things, I always have this little saying in my head: I can do whatever this is for you because you have done so much for me. If we just keep that in perspective, we can give up our selfish will.
Yes.
We can give up our ego and our agenda. And
well, you brought up something that I want to address as we close. Will Willimon, in his commentary on the book of Hebrews, says that Jesus exhibits what he calls the parabola of salvation. And here's what he means. And we're going to look at this next week. Jesus starts off being presented, being on the right hand of God up here. Okay? He's on the right hand of God. Down here, we have Jesus in the grave. And he submits himself to death, goes into the Hadean world, and God raises him. And then up here is the ascension, where he goes back to the right hand of God. So Will Willimon calls it the parabola of salvation with what Jesus did. He starts up here. He empties himself of the place that he could grasp hold of. Says he didn't. He became the form of servant, form of man, was crucified, buried, and then guess what? When he was raised from the dead, he also ascended back to the right hand of God. I thought, wow, I never thought of thinking about Jesus exhibiting that parabola of salvation, which I thought was kind of fascinating. But we'll pick up there next week on this passage because it is so critical, not only to what's going to come up later in the book of Philippians, but also how it helps us see what the mindset of Jesus needs to be as we live together in the body of Christ as brothers and sisters. So, well, thank you for your participation this morning. This is an exciting section of Philippians, and I hope you're getting into it too.